Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Mackenzie delivering his first online lecture, episode 1, titled Japan and the Manchuria Crisis. My hope is that you're following along at home, taking the notes as you would in school, and adding any kind of extra info that you may hear me saying. So, this is all new for me, too. I'm used to talking in front of an audience. Now I'm just in an empty room, hoping not putting you guys to sleep. So, without further ado, here we have our first episode, episode 1, Japan and the Manchuria Crisis. Let's begin now. First, we're going to start, as we always do, with a look at the map. Okay, we have our European influence in China. If we look at the map of China, we can see a lot of European influence there, a lot of spheres of influence by Western nations, Western European nations, but we also see Japan in there as well. We see regions controlled by the British, the French, the Russians, the Germans, and of course, the Japanese. We can see Korea is controlled by the Japanese. We know that Japan has been expanding since their earlier conflicts. We discussed the Sino-Japanese War. We discussed the Russo-Japanese War. And of course, Japan's involvement in World War I. All of which Japan kind of felt like they were getting unfairly treated. Remember, we talked about those unequal treaties that Japan was forced to sign. Now we're going to see through much of the 30s, Japan taking a more aggressive stance and to go out and take what they feel is rightfully theirs. The rest of China at this point is fractured. It's divided. There is no kind of central government in China. That has kind of been deposed of a Chinese emperor back in 1911. And what we got now was a divided China with different sections controlled by warlords. The last emperor of a united China was this guy right here, Pu Yi. He's the last emperor of China. We talked about him in class. We showed the little movie trailer about him as a young boy. He was the last emperor of united China. After this, China becomes a decentralized entity, meaning it's controlled by different warlords. And it's going to be very tough for China to get united as one again. Okay, as we talked about in class, China is going to suffer a civil war between Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists. So in China in the 1920s, we have this guy, Chiang Kai-shek. Sometimes we'll also refer to him as Zhang Jixi. If ever you see that on an IB exam, on a paper 1, if you see Zhang Jixi or Chiang Kai-shek, it means the same person. He is the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. You might also see that, the Kuomintang or the KMT. That's what he is control of, the Chinese Nationalist Party. We also have this guy, Mao Zedong. Now you're going to learn a great deal more about this guy in grade 12 as he eventually comes out victorious in the Chinese Civil War under communist rule. So he's the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Most often you'll see it referred to as the CCP. Now, for the most part, these guys have the same goal. Okay, they really want a united China. They're looking to push foreign government out of China, and that includes Japan as well. They want to push Western European influence out. They want to push Japanese influence out. They just really differ in how it should be governed. Zhang Jixi wants a more nationalist republic, while as Mao Zedong wants a communist state. So from 1926 to 1928, we're going to get what's known as the Northern Expedition. Okay, Zhang Jixi and Mao Zedong, they're going to join forces. This is started by Zhang Jixi or Chiang Kai-shek, same person, started by him and his Chinese nationalists, and the goal is to start in the south and head north and try and unite all of these different fractions of China that would have been ruled by these different warlords. Eventually, Mao Zedong is going to join in on this cause, and together, as they're united, they're going to have a united front. They're going to start in the south, and they're going to push north into kind of the northern territory, bring all of these different regions of China together. If we look at the pictures here, if we see clockwise from the top left, we see Zhang Jixi inspecting soldiers of the National Revolutionary Army, the NRA troops marching northwards. An NRA artillery unit engaging in a battle with warlords. People showing support for the NRA. Peasants volunteer to join the expedition. NRA soldiers preparing to launch an attack. Eventually, there's going to be cracks in this united front. By 1927, the united front of Zhang Jixi and Mao Zedong is going to fall apart. Although they did have the common goal of uniting China together, their differences were too great on how China should be run. Nationalist republic on one side, communist state on the other. So boom, it explodes, as you can see there in the little animation, signifying the ending of their once friendship. The first united front has fallen apart. And this really starts the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. It begins in 1927. Again, I'm sure you'll go over this in greater detail in grade 12 when you're doing a look at authoritarian states. Mao Zedong is really a big figure there. The Chinese Civil War is something that you're going to hear a lot about during this case study. It begins in the late 20s, as we see 1927, when the United Front falls apart. It's going to continue through much of the 30s. It's actually going to pause during World War II. They'll kind of set differences apart and fight a common enemy. But once World War II is over, the Civil War is going to pick up again until it eventually ends in 1949. And of course, this Chinese Civil War is a conflict between the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, Zhang Jixi, and Mao Zedong and his communists. Now let's take a look at Manchuria and China. This is a picture of Zhang Zuolin. He's a Manchurian warlord. Zhang Zuolin is pretty much running the show in Manchuria. As any warlord would, they have complete control of their region. Now he's looking out at the rest of China, and he sees that there's trouble within China. Obviously, there's that Chinese Civil War, and maybe Zhang Zuolin can use this moment to further expand the territory and economic power of Manchuria. At this point, we also want to kind of remember that Manchurians are different, ethnically speaking, than Chinese. We, in Western culture, might look at this photo of Zhang Zuolin and say, he looks Chinese, he's Chinese. But he's different. He is Manchurian from Manchuria. Further back in China's history, the Chinese dynasty eventually invades the Ming dynasty, which is Manchuria, and absorbs them into their dynasty. But they are different ethnically speaking. Now, Zhang Zuolin doesn't want the Northern Expedition to make its way to Manchuria. He doesn't like the idea of this Northern Expedition because what Zhang Zuolin really wants is to hold on to his autonomy. We should understand what autonomy means, his own kind of self-government, his own self-reliance, his own independence. He doesn't want to be swallowed up and controlled by the rest of a united China that this northern expedition is trying to accomplish. Zhang Zuolin does not want this. So who is he going to look to for help? Who's he going to look for in aid to maybe push out this northern expedition or a Chinese takeover of Manchuria? Who do you think? So you probably guessed it. Zuolin sides with the Japanese and will receive aid from the Japanese. He is now in the Japanese pockets. And Japan is actually quite happy with this as well, because they don't want to see Manchuria join with a united China. It will make things much more difficult for Japan if Manchuria is now part of a united China. So they're very happy to give them aid and assistance so that they can maintain that small sense of autonomy. It's going to be easier for Japan to control Manchuria if they don't have to worry about the rest of China. But Zuolin, the Manchurian warlord, starts to see that the northern expedition has some fractures in it. It's starting to crack. He sees it's the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. Maybe he thinks maybe this is a good time now to go and attack China. I mean, he's a Manchurian warlord and he's looking to expand, and he can use his Manchurian forces to do this. Now, Japan is not happy with this. Japan does not want to see Manchuria attacking China, looking to expand its borders. That does not play well for Japan. Because if Zuolin loses to Manchuria, it will be taken over by Chinese nationalists, making things much more difficult for Japan to control the area of Manchuria if they have to worry about the rest of China controlling it as well. So, what do you do when someone is giving you trouble? Politically, economically, and militarily, not doing what they should be doing. The result, you probably guessed it, Zuolin is assassinated by the Japanese. Here we have a picture. This happened on June 4th, 1928. Zuolin's train explodes. This is done by the Kwantung Army. Okay, the Kwantung Army. This is the Japanese soldiers stationed in Manchuria. They plan and successfully carry out the assassination of Zhang Zuolin, the Manchurian warlord. Now, why are they there? Why is the Kwantung Army, the Japanese soldiers, why are they there in Manchuria? Okay, feel free to pause the video and answer this question in your notes. I'll stop right now. Okay, so let's answer this question. Why are the Kwantung Army in Manchuria? Well, if we think back to that first slide of this lecture with our map of China and the sphere of influences, Manchuria was in the sphere of influence of Japan. They have economic interests there, so they're going to have a standing army in that area to protect their economic interests. The Japanese weren't the only ones doing this, right? If we remember our sphere of influence map there, we know that the British were doing the same. They would have had the British military in places of China to protect their economic interests, as well as the Americans and the French. The Japanese were doing the same. So the Kwantung Army is in Manchuria there to protect their economic concessions and economic interests in the area. And they had won that through much of their conflicts, through the Sino-Japanese War, through the Russo-Japanese War. They were given larger spheres of influence. They had railroads that they controlled, so they could export a lot of the resources, iron ore and steel and food that they could send back to Japan for their growing population. The Kwantung Army is there to protect Japanese interests in Manchuria. So Japan's response. What's Japan's response here? Uh, quick, uh, quick little test here. This guy, do we remember who he is? Okay, say his name out loud. No one's really with you. It doesn't matter. Yell it as loud as you can. If you said Emperor Hirohito, you are correct. Okay, he is the Japanese emperor um, through the 30s, through much of the 40s. He's the emperor during World War II and afterwards as well. We know that Japan has an emperor divinely chosen, right? We talked about all that earlier this semester. Um, we know the importance of having a divinely chosen emperor. You don't question his authority, but there's also a diet, a legislative body of government with a prime minister in Japan as well. The diet, the government, and the emperor are not happy with this response. They're not happy with the Kwantung Army. Okay, this assassination of Zhang Zulin was not sanctioned by the government. So, what's the response? Emperor Hirohito calls for his prime minister, Tanaka Jishi, to investigate, charge the soldiers as murderers. Tanaka, round up the officers, charge them with murder. But this is now a tough spot for Tanaka. Earlier on this semester, we talked about how the Japanese military are revered and honored in society. Education teaches the public at a very young age to honor the soldiers and to be revered in society. So Tanaka is in a tough spot here because he is elected by the people, but still has to listen to the divinely chosen emperor. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. What's he going to do? Bring in these Kwantung Army as murderers? Ultimately, no, he doesn't do it. He says he can't do it. So we know the public opinion loves the military. They are honored by the military. And ultimately, Tanaka resigns. Who is running the show in Japan? Who do you think? Well, it doesn't look like the prime minister really has much control. Ultimately, it looks like the Japanese military is calling the shots in Japan. So we get another Japanese prime minister. Now, Japanese prime ministers come and go pretty quickly. I don't expect everyone to have all the Japanese prime ministers memorized. For your case study paper ones, they're going to give you the names of the prime ministers, and even in brackets beside it, they'll say Hamaguchi Yuko, Prime Minister of Japan. So you don't really have to memorize all these names. My hope is that when you're reading through these paper ones, you'll read a name and you'll kind of jog your memory like, oh yes, I remember talking about this in class. He is a Japanese prime minister. So he's the next guy. And we're going to go through them pretty quickly. Not as quickly as we get presidents of the United States every 4 to 8 years, or even Canadian prime ministers in the same kind of regard. Okay. Now, Hamaguchi Yuko has the same problem now that he has to try and rein in the military, and ultimately this is going to fail. And if we look at the year that he's brought into power, 1929, this is a big year in terms of the global economy and what's about to happen. I mean, what's around the corner here? The Great Depression. Okay, so 1929, we get the stock market crashing in the United States, which has a huge ripple effect throughout the industrialized modern world. Anyone doing trade with the United States is going to suffer. So there is huge economic concerns in Japan. What is he going to do? How is he going to save money? Well, one of his ideas is to cut the salaries of the officer class, the military. That's not going to fly too well with the military officers. As a result, Yuko is resented by the military. So what do you think's going to happen to this guy? What's the military or anyone in society who holds the Japanese military in such high regard to go out and act on their own? what's going to happen to this guy. So that brings us to the London Naval Conference. Again, here we are in the 1930s with an international conference, again, limiting countries' navy. Japan is there in London. Obviously, they want to be seen on the world stage. The 1920s was this big feeling and spirit of internationalism, that we're going to bring down our armies and our navies. We're going to de-arm the world, right? This is post-World War I, the major world powers coming together and signing treaties limiting a country's naval power. We saw that Japan was a part of that. They were members in the League of Nations. They were part of the 4-Power Treaty, the 5-Power Treaty, the 9-Power Treaty, but they were always treated inferior to Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain. If we remember that 5-Power Treaty, that 553 Treaty, which maintained the United States and the British top billing on the world stage in naval tonnage, always keeping inferior the Japanese. So we got to call back to that earlier discussion when we talked about Japanese reasons for these aggressive moves. They weren't being treated fairly. They were forced to sign unequal treaties, and they wanted to be a major Western style power. So Japan is angry with these political moves that Hamaguchi is conducting, particularly at the naval conference. So what happens? Yeah, you probably guessed it. He's hit with an assassination attempt. He's not killed, but he's wounded just enough to step down from his role as prime minister. Here's a photo showing Premier Hamaguchi of Japan being supported by colleagues just after a would-be assassin's bullet has pierced his stomach and left him seriously injured. The assailant was an unidentified man of about 28 years of age. So really unknown who the shooter was, perhaps a member of the military, or at least someone who held the Japanese military in high regard and felt that Hamaguchi was not doing Japan the proper justice of demanding they being treated fairly and equally to that of the other great Western powers. So again, we get this kind of question. Who is ruling Japan? It doesn't seem like the prime ministers are. One resigned, the other one was shot. So it looks like the Japanese military are the ones who are really calling the shots in Japan. Okay, so now a quick talk about the Great Depression. Now I'm sure you did a big lesson last year in grade 10 about the Great Depression. You would have talked about the stock market crash, the underlying causes of the Great Depression. I'm not going to go into huge detail about the underlying causes of the Great Depression, but we do know that it goes worldwide, but it starts in the United States. And this will affect any country trading with the United States. And it will particularly hurt Japan. The United States will actually put in place tariffs, which will tax any foreign goods coming into its country, ultimately with the hope that the people within the United States buy more American-made and produced products. So this is going to hurt Japan's economy in all of the export goods that they are looking to trade with other countries. So Japan is in need of resources, is in need of iron, steel, and coal. So during the 30s now, right after the stock market crash of 1929 into the 1930s, it's going to need to become more self-sufficient. So we're going to see a big kind of shift at this point in the mentality and tone of Japan. In the 1920s, we had that spirit of internationalism with their foreign policy to kind of to de-arm the world, but to be a part of it with the other Western powers. In the 1930s, that tone is going to shift. It's going to go more nationalistic, more self-driven. And they're going to look to Manchuria for these resources. They already have a sphere of influence there. They already have a standing army there with the Kwantung Army. They control railroads. If they control all of Manchuria, they will have more than enough resources, iron, steel, coal, as well as food, to ship back to Japan and help its war machine and help feed its growing population. Short little video that explains Japan, China, and the Great Depression.
Japan's answer to the economic blizzard of the Depression was war. First, an invasion of Manchuria, and then China. Japan had few natural resources and a rapidly increasing population. She determined to take the raw materials and living space that she wanted by force. Western reaction was disheartening. The League of Nations protested and President Hoover applied meaningless moral sanctions. Not surprisingly, the Japanese ignored both the League and Hoover. The campaign went well, and the militarists became the controlling factor in Japanese politics. As usual, it was the ordinary people who paid the price. The orgy of burning, looting, and mass murder which accompanied the Japanese onslaught aroused anger and sympathy in the democracies, but no action. This bloody war would drag on for 13 bitter years, and through it all moved the refugees. But the very poor and the helpless remain, too frightened, or too helpless even to move.
So some fairly grim imagery there in the video, and sadly to say, things are only going to get worse for the Chinese people. Once the full-on attack of China by the Japanese in the late 30s happens in like 1937, things are going to get much more tragic and horrific for the Chinese people. But more on that later. So here we have an image of the League of Nations. The Japanese government in the last 10 years, like I said previously, has been very international. Japan during the 1920s had that spirit of internationalism, that they were working with Western powers to set limits on how much weaponry or tonnage of shipping countries could have. Even though they were always kind of held down by comparison to what the British or the United States could have, they were still seen to be involved in this international spirit. They were members of the League of Nations. They were members of the 4-Power Treaty, the 5-Power Treaty, the 9-Power Treaty, the Washington Naval Conference, the London Naval Conference. They are there on the world stage, very much a player. But the tone is going to shift in the 1930s to more nationalistic setting now. The Japanese government, the Diet, the legislative body, as well as the imperial family, don't want Japan to invade Manchuria. Why? Why would they not want to have a full-scale invasion of Manchuria? Try and answer that in your head, or write down a few notes. Quickly pause the video and write down a couple of notes of what you think this answer is. So why does the government not want Japan to invade Manchuria? Well, obviously, that would destroy their international stance as a world player. All the gains that they made with this spirit of internationalism, with foreign affairs on the world stage, would be kaput. It'd be over. They would seem very aggressive. And if we remember our talks from World War I, countries don't want to be perceived as an aggressor at war. They want to feel that they have a certain justification to go to war, that they had to because they were provoked, or they had to because look what they were doing to their allies or friends. A full-scale invasion of Manchuria at this time, the world would just see them as a pure aggressive takeover. And that's not what Japan wants to be perceived. But the result is the Kwantung Army invades Manchuria, more or less, without the approval of the emperor or the government of Japan. They are going rogue. Why are they doing this? Why are they going and taking matters into their own hands and more or less starting a war with Manchuria? Try and jot down a few notes on what you think the answer to this would be. Go ahead, pause the video. So why is the Kwantung Army going rogue, not listening to the Japanese government, and taking the fight to Manchuria? Well, we have to remember that the people in China hold the military in high regard. The Kwantung Army is looking for their own sense of honor and victory in battle, and can maybe gain more power and prestige if they are victorious. That's what they're thinking. So in 1931, we get what's known as the Mukden incident. Okay, the Mukden incident. I would recommend you look that up for further detail. It's an important incident that happens that really kind of sets this whole thing in motion. The Mukden incident, which is when we see an explosion of a Japanese railway in Manchuria. So remember, the Kwantung Army is in Manchuria already. They are there to protect the economic concessions and the economic resources that they control within their sphere of influence. So they control this railway. This is a Japanese railway. And how they're going to spin it is the Kwantung Army is going to blame Chinese national terrorists for conducting this explosion. Later, evidence will reveal that this was actually a setup. What a twist! It was actually the Kwantung Army that blew up their own railway that they controlled in Manchuria and then laid blame to the Chinese nationalists. Why do this? What do you have to gain with this? Well, obviously, this is going to give them what they need: justification to go to war. If they can lay the blame to Chinese nationalists, they can say they're attacking our economic concessions in Manchuria. They are attacking our owned railroad in Manchuria. They took the fight to us, so our invasion and takeover of Manchuria will be in a response to that. This gives them what they need. It's justification to go in and start to take over all of Manchuria. Now let's take a look at the map again. Now we can see that something has changed. We can see what the Japanese control. This actual map might be a little bit further along in our timeline than we are, but we see that Manchuria has changed its name. It is now known as Manchukuo. So by 1931, by 1932, Manchuria is now going to change its name to Manchukuo. So here we are now in 1932, and all of Manchuria is now taken over and controlled by Japan. Chiang Kai-shek, basically cut their losses and more or less give up on Manchuria. But, I mean, Chiang Kai-shek has his hands kind of full because they are currently fighting a civil war against Mao Zedong and the communists. That's what he is more worried about right now. Okay, Chiang Kai-shek is more worried about the Chinese communists than he's worried about the Japanese right now. So he's going to cut his losses and kind of give over Manchuria to the Japanese. He wants the deal with communism right now, not so much worried about the Japanese. There was kind of a saying that went along with this. It does have some racist undertones to it, but then again, this was a pretty racist time. The Zhang Zhishi would say that the Japanese is a disease of the skin, and the communists is a disease of the heart. And if you're fighting a disease of the skin or disease of the heart, you're probably going to want to take care of the disease against the heart, because his Chinese nationalists could turn into Chinese communists the next day, a disease of the heart. But his Chinese nationalists will never change into Japanese people, disease of the skin. That would never happen. So he's going to cut his losses with Manchuria, give it up, and kind of hands it over more or less to the Japanese, because he wants to fight the disease of the heart, that is communism, which is more kind of closer to home in mainland China for him. So Manchuria becomes a new state called Manchukuo. Whenever you see Manchukuo on a map, you know that it is at least 1931-32 when the Japanese control it. So they've gotten rid of Zhang Zuolin, who was the warlord of Manchuria. Who are they going to put in charge of Manchukuo at this time? It's going to be a puppet state of Japan, and they're going to have to put in a puppet emperor to control Manchukuo. So who do they bring back? This guy, Pu Yi. Remember, we talked about him at the beginning of this lecture. He was the last Qing emperor of China before the emperor was deposed. This is back in 1911, and then China was fractured and controlled by those warlords. He is now being brought back by the Japanese, and he will be a puppet emperor in control of Manchukuo. But the fighting doesn't stop there. In January of 1932, the Japanese begin attacking Shanghai, the Chinese city of Shanghai, which is, you can look on a map, it is pretty close to the coast. It's pretty much after this time of January 1932, once they've started lay siege on Shanghai, that China eventually agrees to give full control of Manchuria to Japan. Okay, obviously China has a lot on its plate right now. It needs to focus on this fight against communism first. They're in the midst of a civil war. They can't really deal with the Japanese starting to bombard their coastal cities. So once the Japanese are laying siege and bombing Shanghai, they give over full control of Manchuria to Japan. They got to focus on their fight against communism, so they're willing to get rid of Manchuria. Now here we have a political cartoon. This political cartoon actually happens in kind of 1937, but I thought it worked well with what we're kind of talking about here, as Japan is kind of starting to take over areas more in the north, more northern provinces of China. Maybe pause the video and see if you can describe what the message here in this source. Go ahead and pause the video and try and answer it for yourself. Maybe before you do that, if you can't really see it, what we see here is this big kind of dinosaur representing China. We see tiny Japan here, military figure, very small military guy here, but with a big samurai sword. Okay, so Japan is a small country, but carries a big military, and kind of chopping off the tail of the dinosaur here, and the small parts are put in this basket, which says provincial provinces. So what do you think the message is here? The efforts of tiny Japan to chop up dinosaur China with a samurai sword are mocked in this July 1937 Philadelphia Inquirer cartoon, which was published shortly after Japan invaded North China. This is really pretty much the beginning of kind of World War II in China. Very soon, however, newsreels of savage Japanese bombing of Shanghai and headlines announcing sweeping victories over the dragon, China, jolted many Americans into an awareness of Japan's real military strength. So it looks like Japan is kind of chipping away at the northern provinces with their military, while slowly this kind of sleeping giant of China is beginning to awaken to the growing militarism that is Japan. So, what's the result of all of this? All of this military action in Manchuria, them gobbling up Manchuria, becoming a puppet state of Japan, and turning it into Manchukuo, laying siege to Shanghai, a coastal city of China. What is the result of all of this? Well, now it looks like Japan is on the outside. It's on the outside of this spirit of internationalism that was sweeping through the 20s. All of that is gone, okay? Their relationships with the United States, with Britain, with the League of Nations are now destroyed. And in another act of defiance, Japan leaves the League of Nations. Their the delegate of Japan addresses the hall of the League of Nations and basically says, "You guys have been treating us unfairly for years. We're out." And they kind of mic drop it, and they all get up out of their seats and promptly exit the room. And that's it. They're out of the League of Nations, and the world is watching this. And we're eventually going to talk about what the League of Nations, what's their response to this, and everyone's going to see their response is very little. Their response is very little to the Japanese um, just kind of getting up and walking out and saying, "You're not the boss of us anymore. We're doing things our way." The world is watching this. They see that the League of Nations has now been rendered pretty much useless. Italy is watching this. Mussolini is taking notes. Hitler is watching this. He's taking notes too. They're gonna follow in the same kind of footsteps as the Japanese. Japan's military, it looks like they're the ones calling the shots. They're the ones controlling the government, and it's the public that are in total support of their military. Total support of the Japanese military to, to go out with this aggressive military actions in Manchuria. As we kind of finish here, we see this political cartoon. This is a very famous one. I would take a good note of this one. This one is done by David Lowe. IB loves to use David Lowe political cartoons. Feel free to Google search David Lowe political cartoons and just kind of keep them in a separate kind of document. They use him quite a bit. This one is titled The Doormat. Maybe pause the video here and try and answer what the message of source B is trying to say here. Go ahead and pause. I'll be back in a sec. So this is a very famous political cartoon, one that does tend to show up on paper one case studies for Japan. So do take note of it, okay? This one's titled The Doormat. And here we have our scene of our Japanese military general entering. He's being welcomed into the League of Nations. Even though we talked about Japan leaving the League of Nations in this slide, this political cartoon shows how Japan was being welcomed into the League. Right? He's going up the steps, being welcomed into the door. So Japan, we look at the size of the figures as well. Japan, although small, is dressed very militaristic. He's bringing the sword to Japan. We see Japan written right there, and he's wiping his feet. Okay, the League of Nations, the metaphor here is that they are the doormat. Japan is wiping its feet on the League of Nations, on the honor of nations, and stepping over the League of Nations and being welcomed graciously by the delegates. The League of Nations, though, although it's being used as a doormat, wants to maintain its integrity, wants to make it seem like it's still doing its job. That's why we see this scene here with kind of this butler figure kind of putting makeup on the league, face saving outfit. That even though Japan is treating the nations poorly, wiping its feet on the league, it wants to maintain an image that it's doing its job. But it's not. And that's going to be seen clearly when Japan ultimately bows out of the League of Nations and sets its course for a more aggressive um, attack against China.
Japan was universally condemned, but her response was blunt.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese then just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria.
And I think that's just a good place to stop right now. That is the end of episode 1, the Manchuria crisis. So hopefully you made it to the end. If you made it to the end, congratulations. Good for you guys. Give yourselves a pat on the back. Hopefully I did not put you guys to sleep. Hopefully you took some notes. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me. Maybe it's a good idea for you guys to start collaborating together on some Google Docs and have a little kind of discussion forum. That would be a great idea. But we'll see you next time on Mr. Mackenzie's Distance Learning, where I'll talk about the international response to this more aggressive stance that Japan is taking. So that's it for me. Take care and stay safe.